Welcome, everyone, to this week's Xojo webinar. I am Paul Lefevre, the Xojo Developer Evangelist. This week, you won't get to hear me talk too much, other than to say that if you're new to our webinars and you're not too familiar with Xojo, it is a rapid application development tool that lets you make native apps for a wide variety of platforms. And my good friend here, Tim Dietrich, is going to be talking to you about how you can use Xojo to connect to the awesome Airtable APIs to kind of use it as a cloud database. So, Tim, the floor is yours.
Okay, sorry for all the delays and technical issues, but I'm assuming that everything's working. So again, I'm Tim Dietrich. I am the developer evangelist for Airtable. And my screen is acting funny, so I don't know that we're completely out of the woods yet. But anyway, I'm the developer evangelist for Airtable, and I'll talk a little bit about what Airtable is in just a moment. I also run a mobile app development company, and I've got the word stealth on there because it's something that I do but don't really advertise just yet. Got a bunch of clients that I'm doing mobile apps for, but honestly, there's so much demand for that right now that I'm not even advertising it, so maybe that's a good thing. I've been using Xojo to develop iOS apps for about 6 months now, and there's kind of a long story as to how and why I ended up using Xojo. You can read about it on my blog if you're interested, but I looked at a bunch of different tools and ultimately decided that Xojo was a good fit for me. So again, I've been using that for about 6 months now, and specifically experimenting with and developing iOS apps. And more recently, I've been looking at some of its other capabilities too, which I'll talk about in just a moment. And you can learn more about me at timdietrich.me. So that's enough about me. So what is Airtable? So I guess before I get started, we're not exactly sure who on the webinar today is familiar with Airtable, familiar with Xojo. Maybe you're not familiar with either one. So I'm going to very quickly cover what Airtable is and what Xojo is, and then talk about how the combination of those two is a very powerful combination. So Airtable is a secure cloud-based real-time database. I think that's kind of interesting. There's nothing to install on your computer, although there are native apps, or there's one for iOS. It has an interesting spreadsheet-like interface, which again, I'll show you in just a moment. But the fact that it has that type of interface makes it very easy to use. And people that are new to databases, I think, take to it because of the fact that it kind of looks and acts like a spreadsheet in many ways. It also supports collaboration, which is really an interesting feature of it. I won't be showing that today because it's kind of challenging to do that on a webinar. I might try to pull it off at some point in the future. It also syncs across all your devices. So because it's in the cloud, it doesn't matter whether you're sitting at your desktop and accessing your Airtable databases through a browser or whether you're on your iOS device, you always have live data to work with. It syncs automatically. It's really pretty amazing. And it's very easy to set up and use, as you'll see in just a moment. So for those of you who have never used Xojo before, as Paul mentioned, it is a rapid application development tool. It's great for creating native apps that run on desktops, on the web, iOS. The targets that you can compile apps for are, again, iOS, Mac, Windows, Linux, web, and Raspberry Pi, I think, is coming soon. Is that right, Paul? I think that's the next release?
Yes, Raspberry Pi is very soon. I just got my Raspberry Pi a few days ago. I'm playing around with it. Fun stuff.
Very cool. Okay, so the Xojo IDE, the Integrated Development Environment, is made up of a bunch of different things. One is the fact that you can use it to create apps that have a bunch of different types of objects, as you'll see as I create the app. It has a modern object-oriented language, which I really like using. I've worked with Swift and I've worked with a bunch of other languages, and to me, Xojo is just really logical, very easy to use. It also includes an integrated debugger, and again, it can compile for multiple targets as a multi-platform compiler. So there's not much you can't do with it. So why the combination of Airtable and Xojo? What makes that so interesting and appealing? Well, first, with Airtable, you can very quickly develop a database. And again, I'm going to show you that in just a second. We'll create one using a template, although creating one from scratch is equally, I think, equally easy. But one of the things as a developer that appeals to me about Airtable is the fact that it provides an API right out of the box, meaning as soon as you create a database in Airtable, whether you've created it from an existing template or you've created it from scratch, you instantly, immediately get an API that goes along with it. It's a RESTful API, and I'll demonstrate that as well. It's dynamic, meaning that if you change the schema of your database, the API reflects it immediately. So one of the things that I'm seeing people use Airtable and specifically the API for is to use Airtable as a CMS, in some cases for mobile apps, other cases for web apps. But today, for this demonstration, we'll be using Airtable as a CMS, and I'll show you how you can publish the data that's in Airtable to an iOS app. So what Xojo brings to this combination, obviously, is the fact that you can rapidly develop native solutions. So today we'll be focusing on iOS, but you could also, again, have created a rapidly developed an application for desktop or web. So, you combine Airtable and Xojo, you can get a solution up and running very quickly. So what I'm finding is that the combination of Airtable and Xojo is really interesting when you're trying to prototype something. So the depends on what your needs are. So today I'm going to show you a quick demo of Airtable. Then I'm going to show you how you can use Xojo to create an iOS app that pulls data from Airtable. We'll do that through the API. And then I'll answer any questions that you have. So let's get right into the demo. So I'm going to switch over to my browser and finally got my cursor back. I don't know about you guys, but I always find when I lose the cursor that it's a little scary. And when you're in the keynote, I think specifically in Zoom, it seems like the cursor is just gone. So it's nice to have it back. Anyway, I'm in my browser, I'm in Safari, and this is Airtable. This is kind of my starting screen, if you will, the home screen for Airtable when you're logged in. And I'm just going to very quickly show you how I can create a database in Airtable. I'm going to do it based on what Airtable refers to as a template. So I'm going to click on New Base. And you can see Airtable provides a bunch of different kinds of templates. These are essentially databases that are ready to go. You can start using them right away. You can modify them, add your own data. There's a number of different templates that are provided in a bunch of different categories. But today I'm going to focus on the art gallery template. And the reason I choose this one is because I think it's a good representation of everything that Airtable is capable of. Specifically, it's got attachments, it's got some nice artwork, so it's very visual. It's a nice base to use for demos. So I'm just going to click Use. And you can see that Airtable has created a new instance of that database for me, and I can name it if I want. We'll call it Art Gallery Demo. See, it's also given me a nice icon there on my desktop. And to get started with it, I just click on it. And here's the database. So as you can see, it's very spreadsheet-like as far as the interface goes. I've got two tables in this base, one for artists, one for the collections of art. The database itself is presented in a sort of row and column-like method. So each column across the top, each row is a record in the database. If I want to expand a record and kind of see it in a sort of detailed view, I can just click here to expand the record. And attachments are here. I can also click on those to expand them and blow them up. You can see I've got columns in this particular database for the artist's name, the art, the bio, and so on. So that's that. And if I wanted to add a record, I just go to the bottom. I'll add myself here. You can see it's, again, very spreadsheet-like. I'm just tabbing between the columns. I can put myself in a bunch of different categories or collections. And one of the really neat features of Airtable is how it handles file attachments. So I can literally drag and drop files right on here if I wanted to, or open up what we call the file picker window. I'm just going to add a piece of art real quick. I'm going to choose Airtable's logo. I could have dragged and dropped that, but with the window the way that it is, it's kind of challenging with the zoom window. As you can see, it has already uploaded the attachment. There it is, attached to my record, and there it is. So that's how easy it is to get our new record in here. You can also copy and paste records in. You can import records from CSV files and so on. But I also want to show you just some of the other functionality here. Get the zoom windows out of the way. If I wanted to add a column, I can do that. Just go scroll over here, and let's put a birth date in. So suppose we wanted to start keeping track of the artist's birthdays. Adding a new column is as easy as clicking on that plus button. And there's a whole bunch of different column types that are supported, including date, which is what I'm going to use for this column. You can optionally choose to also track not only the date, but a time. In this case, we'll just stick with the date. And now if I click down here, you can see it pops up a nice calendar picker, or date picker rather. Just pick a random date. But again, you can add as many different many columns as you want. There's a whole variety of different column types, phone numbers, currency, and so on. Let me delete that. And you can just drag to reorder the columns. So I think you get the idea. Working with data in here is easy. Setting up the database is easy. Once you get the data set up, you have a bunch of different options. You can create alternate views of the data. So if I wanted to have a view that showed me, for example, all the artists whose collections had to do with sculpture, I could create an alternate view for that. I can apply filters to the view. So for example, if I only want to see the artists whose art is actually on display, I've done that there. You notice that the number of records has changed dramatically. Clear that out. You also, with Airtable, you can publish the view. So if I wanted to make this data available on the web and didn't want to do a lot of work to do it, I can actually go in here and create, should I do it over here? Publish this view, and you get a URL, or you can embed the view into your own site. Let me show you what the view looks like. So you can see it's very much like what you saw over in Airtable itself, seeing all the same columns and so on. But this is not editable. So if you wanted to make this available to the general public, you could do that just by, again, either publishing the URL itself or by embedding the view into your own site. So if you're using something like WordPress or some other CMS, you could actually use the embed code, which is right here. And you kind of get a preview of what that's going to look like both on the desktop and on a mobile device. And they give you the embed code right down here in the bottom. So that's another really nice feature. And then finally, you can also create a form view. So if I wanted to, for example, if I had a database of applicants for a job, I could create the base here in Airtable and then very quickly create the form. I can drag and drop all this stuff around and so on. Then I can publish the form, and then when people submit through the form, data goes right into Airtable. It couldn't be any faster. It's really pretty cool. So there's that. Let me delete this form. Get back to the base. So that is Airtable in a nutshell. I could go on and on and on and show you a whole bunch of really cool features, but I don't want to get stuck on the Airtable side of it. But I do want to show you what the Airtable API looks like. So again, as soon as I created this art gallery database, Airtable immediately created for me an API. So to get to the API information, I'm just going to go to Help and API Docs. So the documentation that you're going to see is actually specific to my base. So if I scroll down, you can see there's information about how the API works, how to authenticate. They give you information about what the data coming back when you make the API calls is going to look like. But if you remember, I added a birthday column to my base, and you can see that the API documentation reflects that. So if I were to go back over and create another column or change the column name or anything like that, the API, again, immediately reflects that. So does the documentation. It's pretty wild. So it's doing a lot of the work for you. If you're a database developer or an application developer and you've got that missing middle piece, the API, Airtable is going to provide it for you. So there you go. So let me show you what a call to the API looks like. I am going to scroll up a little bit. I'm just going to grab the application ID. So every Airtable base is assigned an application ID, and that's what I'm copying and pasting right here. I'm going to jump over to a program that I use called Paul. So for those of you who were on last month's webinar where we talked about how to tie Xojo to FileMaker, I showed this application called Paul. It's a Mac REST client, really nice for working with APIs. I'm going to paste in my application ID into this URL. So what Paul lets me do is send API requests, and I'm going to make that now. And here's some of the data that came back. So I'm just going to open it back up. It's expanded everything for some reason. But anyway, you saw here's the URL that I'm using to make the API request. There's some information in the headers that has to do with how I authenticate, but we won't get into all that right now. It's pretty easy. But here are all the records. If I sort of drill in on one, you can see that there's the artist's name. Each attachment is listed in here. So this one artist has like 4 different files or 4 different attachments to his record. If I jump back over, you can see that Al Held sure does have 4 attachments right there. So that's the information on each one of those attachments. What's really nice about the Airtable API is that when it comes to attachments, it actually gives you back a URL that you can use to go right to the attachment. So that gives me the URL, file name, the type, if it happens to be available, the size. It even generates 2 thumbnail images and gives me the URLs for those. So there's a smaller thumbnail and a larger thumbnail, which is really nice when you're dealing with imagery in your application. If you need a thumbnail, Airtable's going to create it automatically, and there's the URL. And if I scroll down, you can see similar information for the other records and so on. So that's kind of what the API response looks like. It's coming back in a JSON format. Xojo's iOS framework makes working with JSON very easy, as you'll see in just a moment. So again, I think tying up the Airtable API with Xojo, putting those 2 things together, it's kind of a dream come true. So there you go. So let me jump back over now to Xojo itself. And I'm going to actually use the base that I just created. I'm going to show you the iOS app that we're going to demonstrate today, and then I'll show you how it was created rather than sort of walk through it and take hours doing that. So I'm going to jump back over to my API documentation, grab that app ID again. Just going to put that right into my Xojo app right here. And now I'm going to run the app so you guys can see what it looks like. So it's going to fire up the iOS simulator. I am simulating an iPhone 4S so that you can actually see it on my screen, but I could simulate it on other iOS devices. And here's the app. As you can see, it's pulling data from, let me get both windows open at the same time. So here's the base, and here's the app, and you can see, sure enough, there's all the artists listed. If I click on an artist and drill in, there's the detailed information. I'm not showing everything in the iOS app, just one of their pieces of art, for example, in their bio. But if I wanted to, I could also list the collections that their art is in. I can show all the attachments. But just for the purposes of this demo, I'm keeping it very simple. I'm just showing the artist's name, a sample of their artwork, and their bio. And if I were to click on another artist, it does the same thing. So there's the app, and then I also want to show you that this is live. So if I jump back over to the base and say apply that same filter that you saw me apply earlier, where I only want to see artists whose work is on display, and then jump back over to the app and refresh. There's a refresh button here at the bottom. Notice that the number of artists has dropped, and it corresponds with what we're seeing over in the base. So there's that. And if I were to come back over here again, maybe also sort the records, sort them by name. Actually, let me sort them. I'll sort them in reverse order here. Doing anything? Let's see. That's strange. Doesn't seem to be sorting for some specific reason. All right. Well, anyway, if I were to sort the view, you would see, if I were to refresh the iOS app, you would see the data sort over there as well. So that's one of the things that's interesting about the API is that you can actually tell it to reference a specific view, and then whatever filters or sort rules you've applied to that view will be reflected in how the data comes back through the API. So there's the app. So let's take a look at how this all comes together in Xojo. I'm going to stop the simulator, and I'll just sort of walk through how the app itself was put together. So at the app level, I've got one method that I'm using. I'll explain that in just a moment, but this actually loads an image using a URL. This is something that was contributed to the Xojo community by Jason King, and in the source for this app, I've got a link back. We will be sharing the source after the webinar, so you'll be able to come in here and look at all this. But again, that's a method that I got from the community. It's one of the things I really like about Xojo is that the community really seems to share a lot of knowledge, help a lot of people out. It's been a great way for me to get up and running with Xojo, and specifically with the iOS framework. So there's a method at the application level. So the fact that it's there means I can call it from anywhere in my app, which is nice. You'll see it when you get the source that I've got some notes in here about the app itself, how it works, what to look for. And then I've got some properties at the app level. I've got my API key, the app ID. And the reason I've made these properties is really specifically for the demo. If the app ID changes, I can just come in here and change it in one place, and that one change will be reflected all throughout my app. I've got a couple of switches here as well. I can choose whether or not I want to show part of the artist's bio in the list view, or whether I want to show thumbnails in the list view. Let me show you what that looks like real quick. It's kind of a mess because the art from the artist, I haven't resized it. It's not consistent. But let me show you what happens if I turn that on and rerun the app. And notice in the list view now you're seeing, you know, a sample image, a sample piece of art from each artist. And because they're not the same size, it looks kind of insane. So it needs some work, but the switch is in there to kind of turn that on. Let me turn it back off. So I've got the properties for the app at the app level. So every Xojo iOS app has two screens, one for iPad and one for iPhone. So if you build a universal app, that app will use these two screens. And the reason for these being here, one of the reasons anyway, is that you can tell Xojo what view to use when the app fires up. So in this particular case, we've been simulating the app on an iPhone. So it's going to load the iPhone screen, and it's going to use my list view, which is down here under views. So here's what the list view looks like. You can see the controls that are on it. And let me show you some of the controls that are actually here. We've got a table. That's where the data is being loaded and displayed. There's a refresh button down here, which I'll talk about in a second. There's a progress wheel that is displayed when the app is calling out to the API and waiting to get data back. It typically happens so fast that you don't see the progress wheel at all. If something goes wrong with the API call, I've got a message box that will pop up. And then the, I guess, sort of trick to making all this work is the fact that I've also got an HTTP socket object that's a part of this view. So what happens is when the app launches and this view loads, we send the API request, and we do that through an HTTP socket. So let me show you how that works. When the view itself loads, there's an event that fires. Basically, the view opens. And here's some of the code that runs when that happens. So I turn on the progress wheel, specify the URL that I'm going to use to make the API call. And you can see in that URL, I'm not only showing or specifying the base to Airtable's API, but here's that app ID. And I'm also telling it I want data from the artists table. And specifically, I want it to reference that main view. So jumping back over here, that's the name of the view on the artist table. Next, we set an HTTP header. This is how Airtable's API authenticates people. You basically tell it, here's my API key. It has the keyword bearer in front of it. So if you are doing this on your own, this is one thing that people tend to forget. They just throw the API key in, and if you do that, you won't be authorized. You need the keyword bearer in front of the API. And then here we actually send the request to the API. So at that point, the HTTP socket is asynchronous, so it's sent the request, it's waiting to get data back. And when the socket gets data back, that HTTP object that I put on the view, its page received event handles the page coming back. And if there's any part of this that sort of makes people's eyes glaze over, it's this part right here. It's, I think, looks more intimidating than it really is. But essentially what this code is doing is saying, okay, we've got a response back from Airtable, from the API. If we got a 200 response back or a status back, that means that the call was successful. And then what we do is we take the content that came back, and it comes back in a format that, or in a structure that Airtable refers to as a memory block. So I first convert that to text, and then I convert it into a JSON object itself. And then the rest of this code is really just kind of walking through the JSON response, the same response that you saw me get over here in Paul, sort of work my way through it, grab things like the artist's name, grab their first piece of art. That's what all this code here is doing. And then what I'm doing is actually, as I'm looping through the data that came back, I'm setting up cells over on this iOS table. So for each artist that comes back, we end up with a cell. And then I've got a couple of other things down here. If they have a bio and we're showing the bios in the list, we show that, we add that to the cell. One of the other things that I'm doing here is actually, there is an attribute of an iOS table for each cell called the tag. And the tag, you can really stick anything into that you want. It's not something that's displayed on the table, but it's something that when the table is clicked, you can look at the tag and say, okay, I know what record they were talking about or what record they clicked on. And in this case, I'm actually shoving the entire record itself, all the fields that came back for that particular record. It's kind of like an array, if you want to think of it that way. It's a dictionary. I'm shoving that into that cell tag so that when the person clicks on the cell and goes to the detail view, I can actually send the whole record over to the detail view and then sort of unpack it and do some of the similar things here I do over there. See that in just a moment. So here's a little bit more breaking down of the JSON. In this case, if we're showing thumbnails in the list, there's some code here that gets the very first thumbnail out and displays it. Otherwise, I just show the normal sort of disclosure type symbol that you see. I don't think I have the app running, but you'll see it again in just a moment. So I get the cell all prepared, I add it to the table, and then it just loops around and around until we actually get to the end of the data that came back. And then I turn off the progress wheel. So again, what happens is the app loads, the iPhone screen becomes active, it loads the list view. The list views open proper or event handler fires, sends off the request to the API. Eventually, the API returns the data, and the page received code runs. We load up the table, and then the user's ready to go. So I mentioned that there's a refresh button here as well, and it has an event called action. So when the button is clicked, this code will run. And it's very similar to what you saw in the open event handler for the list view. I'm turning on the progress wheel, just showing it. I clear the table. That's one thing I didn't do before because I didn't have to when the app initially loads, but I'm blowing out any data that's already in the table. And then I send the same request to the Airtable API. So when that request comes back, this whole thing just runs again. So that's how you saw me initially load the iOS app, make some changes over in the Airtable, and then when I clicked refresh, you saw that it immediately reloaded everything. And that's how that all works. So that's the list view. Now let's talk about the detail view. So on the table that's on the list view, there's an action event handler. And when the person clicks a row in the table, this action fires. So what we do is we create a new detail view, which I'll show you in just a second. And then I set the record, which is a property over here on the detail view. I set it to the tag of the row they clicked on. So again, it's all the data about that particular artist, the data that's shown in the cell. And then I load that new details view. So the way that we move between views is we push to them. And that's what's happening here. So we get it all set up and then we push to the new view. So the detail view that gets created looks like this. And just like the list view, it has a bunch of controls on it, not too many, but we have a label for the artist's name. You can see I've got an iOS image view, which is one of the many controls that you can put onto an iOS app with Xojo. And then I've got the description. So that's the bio, essentially. It's just a text area. So these are, think of these kind of placeholders, if you will. And so what happens is when the person clicks on the list view and we navigate to the detail view, when the view actually gets pushed to, we have an activate handler. So what happens is I kind of pull some of the data out of that property that I mentioned before, which is the record. And I'm just saying, okay, let's set the text for the name label to be the name. So there's the name label. And similarly, we've got some code for handling the bio. For the photo, what's kind of interesting about this is that I'm using that app level method that I mentioned earlier, that one up here, so that when the detail view loads, actually grab the URL from the information that came back from the API. I call the load image from URL method, and from that point on, it sort of handles it. It will make a call for that image and then load it right into this image view. So that's how I'm handling the display of that graphic that comes back. So let me run the app again. So there you go. So again, what's happening is the app runs. We initially load the list view. We make the API call. Here's the data coming back. And again, if I were to click on one of these, that event is firing. We're now pushing to the detail view and loading the data for that selected artist. And there it is. All right. So that is it in a nutshell. Again, I want to show just one more time the fact that this is all running real time. So the data that's coming back, if I were to go back over to Airtable and release that filter, maybe I want to show all the artists regardless of whether their art is on display or not. So I'll just relax that requirement. So now I've got 20 different artists displayed. And if I jump back over to the iOS simulator and refresh and scroll down, there you go. So everything's happening in real time. And I think that's kind of one of the many beauties of this. So there you go. Let me jump back over to Keynote here. So let's talk about some of the things that I didn't show. I tried to cover a lot of ground, tried to do it very quickly, but there's still a lot of material, a lot of subject that I didn't cover. One in particular is what I refer to as the API offset. So for example, when you make an API call to Airtable, it is only ever going to return you 100 records at a time. And if it has more data to return to you, it'll also send you an offset. And if you were to make another API call and reference the offset, it'll send you the next 100 records and so on and so forth. I didn't demonstrate that in today's application because I didn't want to get deep in the woods, but it is possible to do it. Also, all the data that's coming back into the iOS app is always been called or pulled from the API. There's nothing that's stored locally on the device, but it is possible to do that. And I think we might do a webinar in the future that shows how that works. Basically, what you end up with is a SQLite database inside the iOS app, and it calls the API when it needs data. Like, for example, if the data is old, or if the user wants to force a refresh of the data, it will make an API call, store it locally on the device, and then serve it back up later from the SQLite database. Also, we're only reading data through the API, but the API is certainly capable of handling creation of records, updates, deletes. We just didn't show anything like that in this particular example. And again, maybe we'll do that in a future webinar. And so sort of going hand in hand with that would be syncing. I'm not doing any of that in this app, obviously, but it's possible where you've got data that's sort of local to the device, and every once in a while you push it up to the hosted database through the API. That's something else that we could do, but just didn't do it in today's demo. There is support for iPads. You saw me running the simulator with just the iPhone, but we could just as well have developed that app for universal, or for one for iPad, one for iOS, with sort of different UIs. And I obviously didn't show you how you go through the somewhat painful process of submitting to the App Store. Thankfully, Paul has already done, I think, another webinar on that. So no need to cover that here. But obviously, I didn't show you what's involved in that. So next steps for everybody, if you're interested in learning more about all this, I encourage you to sign up for Airtable. Just go to airtable.com. There you can sign up and try it for free. There's a free tier. So you can certainly give it a shot on your own. Download Xojo. So if you're not already using Xojo, again, you can download that and try it for free. The only time that you really need to pay is when you're ready to compile an app. So I think Paul can talk more about that in a moment. And I encourage you too, if you're new to Xojo, to check out some of Paul's videos. If you go to developer.xojo.com/videos, he has done a number of webinars, some really great videos that show you how to do a lot of what I did here, but in much greater depth. Everything from iOS, specifically, I think there's a webinar on the sockets, and a lot more. I think that, again, there's one also on how to get your app into the App Store and all the crazy stuff that's involved in making that happen. And then I would just encourage you to experiment with both Xojo and Airtable and just have fun with it. So with that, I guess I'll open up Q&A. So let's take a look. Let me scroll up here. We'll sort of start at the top. Is the database relational? If so, how do you show the related data? Yes, in Airtable, it is relational. Let me get some windows out of the way here. But I'm back over in my Airtable base. Here are the artists. There's a second table in here for collections. Let me scoot this over a little bit. And so the collection column that you're seeing right here is actually data coming out of the collections table. So if I go back to the artist and wanted to add Al Held, the artist, to another collection, I can just click here. It's so basically tying the two records together. It's a related record. It's one of the really interesting things about Airtable is how easy it is to create that related table. So for example, if I've got a whole bunch of windows open here again, let me try to get them all out of the way. So for example, let's suppose that I had let me add a column real quick. Let's suppose this is the state that they live in. And I'm just going to put a bunch in here: Maryland, Virginia, Delaware, California, a couple more for Maryland, California. So suppose I have a column with values already in it, and I decide I want to make that, I really should have made that its own table. I can change the column type to be a link to another record. And I can create the table that I want to link to on the fly. So in this case, I'll just call this new table states. So what's going to happen is when I click save, Airtable's automatically going to create a states table for me, going to automatically load it with records that are values already in this column, and then automatically establish the links between the two tables. And there you go. You can see it's created a states table. It's even showing me the list of artists who are in those states. If I jump back over to artists, there's that state column right there. And if I wanted to add this person to another state, I can do that. So there you go. So you can easily link between tables in the same base. You can't link yet between tables into completely different Airtable databases. There's that one. Get the Q&A back. Can you sort from the iOS app? Yes, you can. One of the things I tried to show and had trouble with it was applying a sort here. Get some of these windows out of the way again. I don't think you guys can see the zoom windows that we see, but there's all kind of mess at the top. It makes it somewhat challenging. Okay, there it goes. So I applied a sort to the table. I don't know if you saw it or not. Let me sort it in the opposite direction. So now I'm sorting them from Z to A, reverse alphabetical order by the artist's name. And if I were to jump back over to the iOS simulator now and refresh the view, notice that it now reflects the sort order on the view. So that's it. Normally, what's coming back to the API is going to be in the same sort order as what you're seeing in the view. But it is possible to override the sort order when you make the API call. So if I were to go back into Xojo, for example, and go into the list view, here's the open event handler. Here's where I'm building up the URL that we use to make that first API call. And I could add sort order information right to the API call itself. To see how you do that, you just come over to the API documentation for that base. And if I scroll down a little bit here, it'll talk about it right at the bottom here, where you can specify a sort field and the sort direction. So again, you can sort of override that. So let me copy and paste this. One of the really nice things about the API documentation is that it shows you sample code both for curl and for node right here in the window. And it's sometimes very helpful. So I'm going to copy that, jump over to my app. Just going to add that. And that's in descending order by name. So if I now rerun the app, what did I do here? I'm having all kinds of technical difficulties with sorting today, but there we go. That's why I'm doing it in descending order, like an idiot. Let me run it again. So this time we should see the artists in ascending order. So even though the view itself over here still has them sorted in reverse alphabetical order, the app now is overriding that with the API call, and you can see they're now in alphabetical order. So very good question. Putting all data of a record is placed in the cell tag, isn't that going to eat up too much memory of the device? Yes, that is possible. So the question is, when the data comes back and we're building up the iOS table, I'm actually taking the entire record and putting it in each one of the cell tags. So the question is that going to potentially cause some memory issues? And yes, it could. If I wanted to be a little more efficient about it, I really should. There's two ways to do it. One is just put the data into the tag that I need when I push to the detail view. And another approach that I've used in the past is to actually take the ID of the record itself, put that into the cell tag, and then push to the detail view, and then have the detail view make a second API call to Airtable and ask specifically for that one record. So that's a much more efficient way to do it as far as memory goes. The way that I'm doing it, I think, is more efficient as far as performance goes. There's only really one API call for all the data, and then those individual API calls, not really API calls, but URL requests for the images. But it's a very good question. Do you use an editor to write the code freeform? I think you can. I don't. So when I'm working in Xojo, I'm actually using the IDE. I do all that right here. One of the really nice features of the IDE is that, first of all, obviously it ties everything together very nicely, but it also can do some auto-completion. So for example, if I wanted to do something else with that HTTP object, if I start to type, you can see it's going to try to auto-complete for me. And if I hit tab, it'll also show me some of the methods and properties of that particular object. So whether it's an HTTP object or it's a control on a view, The IDE makes getting to that just much nicer, I think. So I don't develop outside of the IDE, but you could certainly copy and paste the code. It's just text. So you could use your favorite editor. I just choose not to. Can you edit records to the API? Yes, again, you can certainly do that. You can create, update, and delete records through the API. One of the really interesting things about it, again, we didn't show it in this particular example, is that when it comes to attachments, if I were to send it the URL to a file, whether it's PDF or PNG, whatever, I can actually just pass the URL through the API, and the API will go and grab that image and put it right into the base. So yeah, it's pretty neat. All the functionality of the API, as far as creating, updating, deleting records, is just very well done. All right, maybe a bit off topic. What is the advantage of using the image view? I tend to use Canvas for images. I don't know. I have never used the Canvas for images. For me, the question really was, why did I choose to use the image view control here on the detail view? It just seemed like the right type of control for me to use. It also allowed me to use that load image from URL. So again, like, let me show you that event. Loading that image view was just dead simple when it comes to, or as a result of using that method. So that's why I chose to use it. It seemed like a really easy way to do it. Let's see. Bit confused by the view table object. The data storage object. Okay, so the question has to do with the table control on the list view. And the question is it a data storage object, or is it just a drawing object for the screen, or something in between? It's really something in between, although you could just use it to present the data. When the data is loaded into the table, it's really only for display itself, but the events that the table supports, and in particular, in this case, we're using an action event, meaning that somebody clicks on a cell. That's where it becomes somewhat interactive, and also where that cell tag comes into play, because you're going to want to know when the person clicks on a specific cell what record they clicked on, so that when I push to the detail view, I can take action on it. So it is kind of a little bit of both a control that can be used to, obviously, its primary function being to display data, but it can also be to store it. I don't know that you would. You wouldn't want to store it there permanently. It's going to clear out as soon as the app closes, so it's temporary. So it's not, when we say that it's a table, it's really a table for display in the app itself, but it's not something that you're going to use for permanent storage or anything like that.
If I can just jump in, Tim, I'll also add the iOS table kind of works in the two ways that Tim said. You can just manually add rows to it in the way you want. And of course, you can hook it up to a data source and then write your own classes that will fetch the data from the data source and provide them to the iOS table for display. So if Tim had wanted to, he could have set up a data source that was essentially the JSON data that came back from the API, use that as the data source for the iOS table here, and then written a class that kind of pulled out of the JSON the appropriate things to tell the thing to display. So it works two different ways.
Yeah. Thanks, Paul. Another question is, can you add sort/filter controls to the app? Again, I kind of showed just a second ago how you can make API calls and override the sort rules that are being applied to the view that's being referenced. The API right now, though, does not support filtering on the fly. In other words, right now, if I jump back over to the view in Airtable and I reapply that filter, I'm going to set it up so that we're only seeing records for artists whose work is on display. Right now, when I make an API call, that's what I'm going to get back, that right there. So if I jump back over here and rerun the app, I'm only going to get back that data. So again, it's just that sort of subset of all the records. These are the artists whose work is on display. Now, I cannot programmatically through the API override the filtering. So if I were to come back down to the open event handler, there's nothing in the URL right now anyway where I can say, okay, I want to override the value. I want to get all records. I don't care about the filter that's on that view. So yeah, so while you can override the sort, you can't override the filtering, at least not yet. Let me jump back to Q&A. Can it be sold as an application? Yes, that's actually one of the things I think is really appealing about Xojo is the fact that you can compile this, you can submit it to the App Store. We've had people do it. I know some other developers that have done it. Paul, I think you were the first one to get one through, right?
Yeah, I have the world's fanciest tip calculator sitting in the App Store that was made with Xojo.
You're making millions off of it, right?
Exactly.
So yeah, I mean, these are native apps. They can be submitted to the store. And again, today we're only focusing on iOS, but you could also compile apps for Windows, for Mac, for Linux. There's an interesting web option as well, and soon Raspberry Pi. All right. So I think that's it. Sort of scroll up. I know a lot of questions came in while we were, yeah, I think that is it. We had a bunch of people commenting while we were trying to get the technical issues worked out, but I think that is it. Oh, here's one more. Why should I use Airtable instead of MySQL? Both are live DBs, and for MySQL, there are web-based UIs. Good question. For me, I like using Airtable because it's easy, it's simple. To get the API for free. But I think one of the nice things about Airtable is that just about anybody can create the database. And so what I'm seeing is in some cases we've got users who aren't necessarily technical, but are going into Airtable and creating their own databases. And then they want to use that data in other ways. So for example, they've got the data now in an Airtable base, and they want to use that as sort of a content management system for maybe a website, or in the example today, they want to publish that data out to an iOS app. So it's the fact that with Airtable, anybody can create a database. And with the API, you can take somebody who's somewhat technical, go through the API to get to that data and do something with it. I think MySQL would be a little bit intimidating for most non-technical people, whereas Airtable isn't necessarily the case. Is there any way to select code snippets like in FileMaker, or do you have pretty much know how to code? So I think the question here is, do you need to learn to program in order to use Xojo? And I think the answer is a definite yes. This isn't, point and click like it would be in something like FileMaker. You see some of the code that I'm writing over here. I actually wrote that from scratch, or begged and borrowed it from other examples that I saw. But this is all code that you really need to write. It's not as sort of it's not as point and click as other environments might be. So yes, you need to learn how to program a little bit. You need to definitely learn the Xojo programming language. I don't really find it all that intimidating. I do have a programming background though, so maybe I'm a little biased on it or whatever. But yeah, you definitely need to learn how to code to use this. So the other question that came in is what language is the code in? And it actually is the Xojo programming language. Xojo used to be, and Paul, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it used to be real basic. So it's an object-oriented sort of basic-like language. That's how I would describe it. I find it very easy to write in. It's very logical. And again, when you're in the IDE, I don't necessarily know all of the methods and properties of all the different things that I can work with in here, but the IDE makes that somewhat easy because it tries to autocomplete for me, shows me what the properties are that are available. So learning it, I think, is pretty easy, and there's a lot of really great resources online that not only show you programming in general, object-oriented programming specifically, but there's some really great Xojo-specific resources that you can refer to as well.
Yeah, Tim, and I'll just jump in if I can for a second.
Sorry.
Just regarding the language, yeah, it is a proprietary language. It's called Xojo, just like the entire product is called Xojo, and it is a fully object-oriented language. You probably could compare it most closely to something like VB.NET, C# or Java. It has an object model very similar to those languages. The syntax is more close to VB.NET than anything else. And if you're more curious about the particular syntax or any details of the languages, you can just head over to developer.xojo.com. Tim referenced there where all our videos are, but there's also a whole bunch of other developer type reference materials, including the entire language, links to all kinds of getting started materials if you want to just, play around and bang out.
Yeah, I think I could go back to my slide here in the keynote. Right.
Yeah.
I jumped back to the slide here. I mentioned, right there. So developer.xojo.com. The videos that Paul has already recorded are great resources, but you'll find a lot of other good resources on that URL as well. But I should also point out that when you download Xojo, there's a folder, and I think I can show it here, in the application itself. Xojo example projects. And there are a lot of really great example projects here. You can actually just load them right up into Xojo. Here's the iOS. My window's being blocked again. Okay, here we go. So there's a bunch of different iOS example applications in here that show you things like how to work with networking, how to deal with graphics. So for me, that's been one of the really great ways to learn to program in Xojo, is to look at the examples, look at what they do, and then look at the code behind them. Between that and the forum, which I should also mention, I think if you go to, one of these days I'm gonna just find a way to get rid of that bar, Paul, the Xojo bar at the top there. I think it's forum.xojo.com, which I type forum. There it goes. So here's the Xojo forums. This is another really great resource. If you've got specific questions about things, chances are somebody's already run into the same thing. You can search the forums. I've found this to be just a fantastic resource for learning Xojo, and specifically the iOS framework, although I've poked around a little bit in other areas of the forum about the web apps. So again, the Xojo community is just, I think, fantastic. It's a great resource for you if you're starting out. So there's that. Let me see if there's any other questions. There we go. Yeah, I think that's it. The only other one I have, Paul, is pricing. Do you want to talk a little bit about how the Xojo is priced, or?
Yeah, I certainly can. Well, as Tim mentioned regarding pricing, first of all, Xojo is free to use to play around with, learn, build apps, run them in debug mode. You can run them in the iOS simulator, and that's all free. You can just download Xojo and do all that. You only need to buy a license when you actually want to build something, so you can distribute it. And great, Tim brought up the pricing page here because I probably wouldn't have remembered all of them. But essentially, it starts at $100 for desktop type stuff and goes all the way up to a couple thousand for the enterprise version. By far, the Pro one is the most popular one because that includes everything and allows you to build desktop apps for OS X, Windows, Linux. It allows you to build web apps that can run on web servers that run on OS X, Windows, or Linux. And it also allows you to build iOS apps that can run on, of course, iPhones, iPads, and iPod Touches, I guess. But you can see the little grid here for what you get and various things. So that's the pricing. And I do want to add, since Tim introduced me to Airtable, that I've been playing around with it a bit myself, and it is amazingly easy and cool. And someone had asked, why would you use something like this over MySQL? Personally, I could see when I was doing consulting why I may want to use this over something like MySQL, and it's because it's so darn easy to make a database that is cloud-based that then I could have had one of my clients connect to review something or input some data or something like that. So I was able to make a desktop app that connected to one of the demos very, very quickly, probably in an hour maybe, and it was able to pull down stuff, update things. The API is very nice. And I think Tim and I are going to be working to see if we can make this even a little bit simpler. So.
Okay, so I think another question for you, Paul, was how many Xojo users do you think there are? Do you have any idea how many Xojo users are out there?
Well, if you go to the front page of the Xojo site, I think we had a count.
Oh, yeah, there you go. 290,000 users.
Yeah,
worldwide.
So I mean,
right there.
Lots of people buy Xojo, use it for small projects. Lots of people use it for consulting projects. Lots of people use it in their own companies to build things. It has so many different uses that we have quite a gamut of types of people that use it. So certainly if you're curious about, how you might use Xojo to build an app, or you have specific questions on that, or you have an app idea and you want to know if you think Xojo might be a good fit, you can always email me directly, of course, paul@xojo.com. I can help you answer those things. And if you just want to chat and get opinions of others, go to the forum, ask away. Then you won't get any biased opinion from Xojo staff. You can ask people that use it, see what they think.
And there's our email addresses there on that final slide as well. So there's Paul's email address and mine. So if you've got Xojo specific questions, feel free to email Paul. And if you've got some questions about Airtable and the API, feel free to drop me a line. And I think that's it. I don't see any other questions in the window. So I want to thank everybody for coming. Paul, thanks for making this possible again.
Well, thank you, Tim, again, for helping me out by doing a webinar on a cool product. I will note for everyone that's here, the recording of this will be posted later today or tomorrow, along with links to the projects that Tim showed, and I'll probably even make a link available to the project I made as well. And again, if you have questions, feel free to shoot us an email. All right, thanks, everyone. We're going to stop this webinar now.